Hello. Hello, bonjour. My name is Megan Ho, and I'm the assistant curator at the Ottawa Art Gallery. On behalf of the OAG, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for our panel program this afternoon. Before I go further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Ottawa Art Gallery operates on the beautiful Anishinaabe Aki. The Anishinaabe have been on this territory, known today as the City of Ottawa, since the beginning of time. All sorts of art forms have been, continue, and will continue to be a part of the vibrant Anishinaabe culture. In this afternoon's program, which will be moderated by Penny Cousineau-Levine, the curator of Art School Confidential, celebrating 50 years of the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Ottawa, artists Rebecca Bair, Martin Golland, Cara Tierney, Sarah Tompkins, and Jinny Yu, along with art historian Anna Paluch, will discuss questions central to the education of studio artists and consider, what does art school do? The program will address three main questions, and after each question, we will open the floor to the audience for any Q&A. We have a wireless microphone, which we will bring to you in the audience should you have any questions. And please note that the discussion and question period will be recorded and shared to the OAG's YouTube channel after the program concludes. This program will also take place in English, but we are also able to offer French interpretations of any questions throughout the question period. Before we get started, I also want to take a moment to thank Penny Cousineau-Levine for all of her work on this program, along with the University of Ottawa Department of Visual Arts for their long-standing partnership with us. I also want to thank our core funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Ottawa for support of programs like this. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and without further ado, I'm now pleased to hand the floor over to Penny to introduce our panelists for today.
Is the mic working? Yes, okay, great. So I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly. They all have incredible CVs, have very impressive experience in their respective domains, but I'm just going to do very short introductions today related to their teaching backgrounds. That's what our panel is about. So Cara Tierney has taught and teaches in the Department of Visual Arts, both history and theory and studio courses. Martin Golland, long-standing, but still very youthful, long-standing teacher. I'm sensitive to being introduced that way, so I'm sure everyone else is, in painting and in interdisciplinary workshops in the department. Anna Paluch, who was at one time an art history student in the Department of Visual Arts, recently was granted their PhD in art history and teaches in the department. Rebecca "Becky" Bair, a student in the department who has been a teaching fellow at the Ontario College of Art and now teaches at Emily Carr in Vancouver. Jinny Yu, another youthful but long-standing teacher in the department, and also once upon a time taught at Mount Allison in New Brunswick, but has taught in our department, Visual Arts, for many years. Sarah Tompkins, recent MFA graduate whose work is in the show upstairs and in the MFA show, and who has taught both theory and studio at the Ottawa School of Art. So great panel. And the way that we're going to have the discussion this afternoon is that there are three main questions or topics. Going to allot, let's say, 20 to 25 minutes to each of those, and then have questions and answers after each topic. So you don't have to try to remember an hour from now what was said on the first topic. We'll have the questions and answers for each topic separately and see how that goes. So before I proceed, I'd just like to get a little sense of the audience and so that we can have a true conversation. How many people in the audience at one time or other were students of the Department of Visual Arts? How many were students in other art schools? Right. Some people may be both. Who has taught art? Can someone who did not, who is an artist? And can someone who did not put up their hand yet volunteer to tell me why they're here? Yes. Perfect reason. As someone else? I believe you are a doctor.
And it's her birthday today.
Someone else who did not put up their hand but is here for. Oh, okay.
Family
We've got family. We've got the family of the department. The blood families. Okay, fabulous. So, and we really do want this to be a conversation, to be a true conversation. So the first question that we're addressing today is, what is art school or art education preparing students for? In some of the publicity for this event, that has been phrased as, what is the role of the art school in relation to the art world ecosystem? So I think we're going to start that off with Cara.
Thanks, Penny. Hello? Thank you, Penny. So I wanted to actually pull back a little bit and talk about the context that art schools are within in order to even attempt to try and answer that question. Because the question, what is this education or art school preparing students for? From my perspective, doesn't have a singular answer, largely because there is no monolithic idea of what a student is. And increasingly, the university is welcoming different kinds of students and is taking strides to serve a greater diversity of students than it has historically. I also wanted to put on the radar, it is now 30 years since Bell Hooks published Teaching to Transgress, in which she invited us to think of approaching students with the will and desire to respond to them as unique human beings, an idea which often still feels radical. And a further quote from that text, to transgress assembly line learning, to embrace multiculturalism, and transgress the boundaries of difference, to see theory as liberatory, to speak openly about essentialism and experience, to embrace feminism, to confront class distinctions, and to form radical teaching communities where we speak truth to one another, something we're hopefully doing today. So as educators, we're employees of an institution. And as humans, I hope that we're committed to our human siblings in ways that maybe transcend the institution. And we're all navigating an institutional structure that often isn't designed to accommodate all of our parts. I also want to speak into the room that we need to recognize that never before have students faced such high tuition or such a high cost of living and such disproportionately low minimum wage. So while we do reduce barriers of access, the reality of ability to participate is not necessarily following smoothly. The politics of inclusion has not necessarily precipitated the structural and ideological reorganization to foster safe passage through in an equitable way. In many ways, the language is ahead of the structures. And so the brunt of this discrepancy is often metabolized and undergone at the level of the student-teacher relationship. So to return to the question, what is education preparing students for? I would say it entirely depends on the individual student's preconditions. Having access to a university is to have access to certain kinds of resources, knowledge and ideas, and oftentimes it really is up to the student to take as much as they can, but of course this is limited by their preconditions. I'm just wrapping up. But in an idealized sense, education is not something that is undergone, but is collaboratively produced, and that we're all constantly learning in that production. And our job, as I see it, is really to help our students find their own unique voice. And hopefully we can equip them with some nuanced understanding of who they are, where they are, and how creativity can soften their passage through life. And you know, as a university, what we do we're sort of a knowledge-making machine. I always encounter my students with like a welcome to the process of finding agency in contributing to knowledge-forming structures.
Jinny.
Hello. Nice to see you all. Thank you, Penny, for putting this exhibition and panel together. I think it couldn't have come at a better time to bring us all together and to celebrate all the accomplishments that the department has done. When I came here in 2006 to Ottawa to teach, I was quite young, much younger, and was thinking about what is it that an art school can do? What is it that I can do in this art school? And of course, there are many different, as Cara said, there are many different considerations, many different situations from which the students come in. Overall, however, I think my job as a professor, I see, particularly in the undergrad, to form people who are able to think critically, who are responsible citizens. Of course, we do provide particular education. We do provide, we teach visual language, learning how to navigate through the world using the visual language and express one's understanding of the art world or the world and the world visually. But I think ultimately my goal is to help form individuals who are able to think and function in a society that is helpful for the greater goods of everybody. I don't know if that's possible, but that is my aim, high aim. The second part of the question relating to ecosystem, art ecosystem, and of course we all are living within some kind of system, and art ecosystem can be very insular, has been very extremely insular. Seems to me that it is slightly opening up. However, we are also seeing some backlash. Very insular in the sense of, if you've heard the argument of like, oh, I just care about excellence. Who defines what excellence is? Who defines what is good, what is valued, and so on? And there has been certain set of rules that art world functions within. I think what art schools can do, and I hope I contribute a little bit in that, is that we question that system. Try to not necessarily just function within, even though it is very important to know how to function within, but to also be able to see the system in itself and then question that and express whatever answers or whatever questions that one comes up with. And so I think it is very important for students to understand what is there, the existing system. But more important than that is for us to be able to question that and have a conversation and so on. So that's my 2 cents on these questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Penny, for organizing this panel. I've been thinking about this question too, and similar to Cara, I want to step back and look at what we mean by the term art world ecosystem, because the more that art proliferates within culture, that definition has changed, and it's changed even since I began as an artist. There are many art worlds, and there are many different ways of participating within them. And there is a tendency to think these days, or there's a tendency to focus on the economics of art. And so when I think of this question, you know, what is the role of art school in relation to the art world ecosystem? It does bring up the question of first of all, who are you making art for, and why are you making it, and what do you want, in a sense, what do you want to get from it by participating within that art world or those art worlds. So I think it's important to state that right away, because a lot of times there is an expectation that the institution will grant you sort of safe passage into that art world that you want to get into. A lot of the times it's people want to find some sort of economic return for the art that they're making, and that's absolutely legit. Like Cara said, there are a lot of pressures for young art students, young artists, and life is more difficult and more expensive to navigate. So naturally, there is a pressure to make money from one's art. So that brings a kind of question to what we're doing here in the institution, because institutions traditionally have taught in two ways. They've begun by teaching a kind of skill set or manual activity, some practical skill that can be used and perfected to then create a kind of business of art, if you will. But then there's the second aspect of art practice, which is about intellectual activity, which is in and of itself the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, and to further and deepen one's understanding of the themes and ideas that one is interested in. So within these two modes, or these two models, there is increasing tension to want to marshal art for the purpose of some deliverable, some product, some end tangible goal. And that's not really the point of art in the broad sense. So what I like to question is the kind of almost a kind of utilitarian view of knowledge, in order to sort of harness knowledge and then create a kind of product or brand or style and so on from it. And well-meaning students come in wanting to do that, wanting to kind of develop a style quickly, have a deliverable, and then to be out there in the world right away. Because we also, and what I've seen over the last 20 years or so, 25 years, is an acceleration of this process of learning about art and then going out into the world. And there is an impatience that I increasingly feel to try to enter the world that one wants to enter into. So, in short, what I hope education offers is the possibility that there are many options within one's practice. For many years, I did not work in. I worked outside of the arts. I made money outside of an art structure, and then had the freedom to make art when I could. And that's while it's not easy, it's the path that many artists go down. And it allowed me an opportunity to grow my ideas. So these are difficult questions to answer, and they don't have one answer to them. And so the second question, which is what are art schools preparing students for? My hope is that we're preparing students for an understanding of where they want to go with the art that they want to make, and also to broaden their understanding of what art is and what could be. And I like to also see that as an opportunity to look at the importance of knowledge for the sake of creating, in a sense, for building character and building intent and purpose. So, and that's different than necessarily using art for a fixed end. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Becky?
Yeah. Okay, good. That's working. Thank you to all my peers for those comments, because I think that they encapsulate a lot of what I would have said. But something that I'm really interested in considering is that in that question, what does art school prepare students for? One of my students says regularly that there isn't an art factory that we get to all go work in after this, right? So we're not learning how to make art necessarily to be artists in the art factory. And I think that's really important to remember. We're artists because we're compelled by creativity. We're at art school because we're compelled by criticality. And I think that it's I think students, as you're saying, Martin, I think a lot of students think that they're gonna go to art school and then they're gonna go out into the world and be an artist and make a ton of money and it's gonna be bliss. And the reality is that maybe in some ways what art school doesn't prepare students for is that that is not the reality, is that that is not what happens after. You don't get every grant that you apply for, you don't get every job that you apply for, you don't get to be a professional painter, photographer, whatever, that easily. It doesn't happen in that way. But what I like to think is that, you know, we go to art school, again, because we're interested and engaged in critical rhetoric around art and how art functions in the world, how it's not, we cannot detach what we're making from the world. We don't get to make beautiful, intricate paintings of our environment without considering that the acrylic paints that we're using have an impact on this planet, and that those impacts on this planet impact then people of color the most. So those kinds of things, I think that is what art school needs to prepare artists for, need to prepare our students for, is that super engaged, critical approach to making, which is about seeing what we're part of, being engaged in the conversations that are beyond the realm of art, that aren't just about the medium that we're working within or the artists that we're really excited about, but rather about this broad world. And I feel really excited actually to speak to this, because speaking about it within the context of the University of Ottawa is very different than speaking about it in relation to Emily Carr, because Emily Carr is an art school and that's it. Or that's a lie. Art and design, I'm sorry to all my designers. But that is what we do, right? That's all we do. We make art and design, and we're engaged in art and design. And of course we have history and, you know, social considerations, and all these critical perspectives and academic perspectives are brought into our art and design making. But at the University of Ottawa, being a department, an art department within an art school, functions very differently then. And that's something that I don't entirely know if I can put words to the full difference. But I think that it's important to acknowledge again that we are global citizens, that we're engaged in, or in conversation rather, with all these other faculties and all these other academic fields. And art school should prepare us to be critical about that engagement, that our larger art ecosystem or ecosystems is the world, right? Is the entire world. Every single other faculty in the world involves art and design in some capacity. So to think that we could separate ourselves is completely untrue. And I think that we should prepare our students not to work in the art factory, but to work in the world, in conversation, in critical conversation with the world, with what is happening currently in the world, and in a way that, I mean, my imperative is to take a decolonial and anti-racist approach. I think we should listen to bell hooks, we should listen to Paulo Freire, all these educators who say that our making, our art, our learning, our teaching is reciprocal rather than one direction. And I like to think that art school is the best place to set us up to do that work.
Thank you. Sarah.
Becky took the words right out of my mouth. I'm looking at my notes here, and it's, you know, I mean, I'll guess I'll jump in a slightly different spot. I mean, my perspective here comes from it's a practical perspective, right? But first of all, Penny, thank you for organizing this, and thanks to my fellow panelists and to everyone for being here. What stood out for me in terms of like the practicality of going to art school, it's the technical skills, it hones your criticality, it'll test and improve your work ethic, and it will absolutely test your resilience. So as far as, I mean, those things are obvious. Technical skills, of course, we're all working in different mediums. Of course, we want to improve and build confidence in the act of art making. I felt quite a good responsibility to enhancing my own sense of criticality, what I call a critical consciousness, when I came into the MFA program at U Ottawa. Understanding my own context was very important for me, and it's something that I feel should be a focus for any given student entering into one of those programs. One of the things that, I mean, when Becky talks about, you know, there's no art factory, right, when you're done, you know, the opportunities are limited, right? They're limited, they're sometimes few and far between. A loved one of mine at one point said, you know, I heard of this thing where you should just go for 200 no's in a year. You're applying for exhibitions, you're applying for grants, see if you can get 200 no's, and you'll get some yeses along the way, but go for all the no's. This is the mindset that I feel has been most helpful for me, but it's something that I wasn't anticipating when I first came into my undergrad at Queen's. But it's the work ethic and the resilience especially, right? The ability to take a no. Those are the things that it may not be what students are, I mean, we will touch on what they're expecting, but that is ultimately what they are preparing you for. Now that's just sort of the practical aspect. As far as the role of the art school in terms of the broader art world ecosystem, I mean, first and foremost, you are fostering the next generation of artists, right? By and large, the people who are most predominantly contributing to that cultural dialogue have been to art school, or people in their circles have been to art school. So that might not show up at the very beginning for a lot of students. Actually, something that Christos Pantieras shared with me. We were in a conversation yesterday when I was doing some final prep, and he had said, you know, when I first did my undergrad at U Ottawa, and I think he finished in '97, so maybe '93 he had started. He said, when I first went, I was actually planning in the end to go to Algonquin, but college was already sort of frowned upon at the time, so I just needed to go and get an undergraduate degree just to sort of legitimize being in a creative field, period. And something that I've heard from my own students and from my peers is that at the beginning, if you're looking at just the undergraduate context, many people go because they were creative in high school and that's what they want to focus on. It's not because they necessarily are going in with high hopes of being an artist. But at an institution like U Ottawa or any other given institution that supports their students appropriately, that's the place where you can figure out how you can be, how you can find a sense of yourself and how you can figure out a way to actually contribute in a positive and generative way to that broader cultural dialogue. So you actually, I have found that most people don't actually go into art school thinking, I'm preparing to be an artist. They go in thinking, well, you know, I wasn't great at math and science in high school actually, you know, so I guess I'll go do this. So that's, I have a lot to say, sorry, excuse me. Beyond that, those are some of the more direct things about what it's preparing you for. What I want to underscore here is that it is where you sort of learn that independence and the work ethic that it takes, because it is very independently motivated. All of those things are sort of self-explanatory, but I do want to touch on, we're talking about the role of art school in the broader art ecosystem. As I've been going through these questions and sort of meditating on them, I think of it more as a responsibility. Art school is not a place where you walk in an undergraduate and walk out an artist. we art school does have a responsibility to be dynamic and responsive for every individual student. It is about the relationships between the teacher and the student, and it is not, I mean, for everyone who's been in studio courses, it's not, we're gonna do workshops all semester. It is very much one-on-one. You are, not necessarily building a close personal relationship, but in my opinion, it should be something that's responsive to the student. But beyond that, I think that art school does have a responsibility to be pushing up against some of the more problematic aspects of sure, the art world, but also art school itself as an institution. So, as Cara touched upon, high tuition costs and high cost of living and accessibility. If you look around pretty much any undergraduate classroom in North America, it's predominantly people who look like me. It's young white women. And so that is sort of course, part of a more systemic issue with accessibility for people who are like people of color, people from marginalized communities. And so I think that art school does have a responsibility to be responsive, particularly to those groups who may not actually be the predominant group of privilege. Beyond that, of course, universities tend towards a Eurocentric curriculum. So when I say that you should be responsive and dynamic, that's also being able to push up against, sort of ingrained ideals about what we believe art to be, and those are Western ideals predominantly. And something that I will note is that the U Ottawa faculty has been fantastic about being open and responsive and challenging in that regard. I feel like I've surpassed my time, so I might leave it there. But there.
Just on a light note, in terms of talking about resilience, one of the books that I was reading to kind of prepare myself for today was Talking Art, the Culture and Practice, the Culture of Practice and the Practice of Culture in MFA Education, written by a sociologist who went to many art schools in the United States, interviewed professors and students, and also get the picture, a mind-bending journey among the inspired artists and obsessive art fiends who taught me how to see, by Bianca Bosker. And Bianca's gallerist friend said that he, in choosing who he would show in his gallery, he often, that's my timer, excuse me, he often would go towards those who had an MFA because if they had what it took to if they had the masochism to stick through grad school, that's a good indication of seriousness. But which, I don't know if resilience is quite masochism or masochism, but sometimes one might think. Anna, let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Penny, and I feel so honored to be on the panel with these amazing individuals. So I'm going to speak from an art historical perspective. I am not a practicing artist. I'm a folk artist, but not a contemporary practicing artist. But I remember going into the art history department and going into this institution thinking, I'm just going to look at pretty pictures and write essays about them. But art school, technically, art history school, it opened my mind to these critical thinking, like all the discussions we are having here today, those discussions were happening in the classrooms as well. It was my first time hearing about feminism. I come from, I was a child of Eastern European refugees. They had other sort of priorities in raising me. So I was learning all about these ways to critically think, to analyze, to be more decolonial, and to see the broader picture, to see outside sort of these Western ways of thinking. And I'm very grateful for that. And I've been doing it until January, just finishing my PhD. So I loved it so much, I kept doing it. And I feel like art school and art theory and art history prepare you and prepare students to know how to think differently, think critically, to question, to be open, and to keep learning. But also something I noticed from my own experience is that art school was a great community builder. And there were very few of us art historians in the department when I was in there. and there were many visual arts students, and it was this symbiotic relationship where my friends were making art and I was writing about their art, and then they kept making art and we kept writing, and then I curated their art, and we formed this sort of little gang until we felt comfortable to start going out and curating about other people and writing about other people and making different art. And it was this beautiful community that was built, and I sort of try to encourage that. Now that I'm a professor and I'm teaching students, I have this one class that looks at global folk art, global craft, and I encourage students, even the theory students, to make artwork, and then when we have workshops and we have a guest speaker come in, to communally make art together. And that's something that definitely I learned in art school, was about this learning to be more critical and have critical thinking, but also to build community. And I kind of feel like that ties into everything that we're saying about supporting and yeah, I don't know how many times I could say community, but that's the main, yeah.
Thank you. This is maybe a good moment before we open it up to questions to mention that on the Ottawa Art Gallery website, under Art School Confidential, you can click for the online catalog for the show. And in the online catalog, there is an essay en français and in English by Olivier Asselin, who is an art historian and filmmaker who did his undergraduate in the department, then got graduate degrees, then came back and taught in the department. And in his essay, he talks not only about his experience as a student and as a professor in the department, but engages with some deeply reflective philosophical ideas around teaching art, the history of how art has been taught, what is happening today, and what he finally comes to is an aesthetic community. But that doesn't just mean, a community that looks at what's aesthetically pleasing and what isn't. And I really invite you to read that very engaging essay. Great, so we will open this section up to a short question and answer period. What does art school do? Yes. Can someone give this gentleman a mic?
Alors bonjour, je m'appelle Moïse. J'ai une question. Je vais parler à propos de quelques points que Sarah a relevés. C'est par rapport au système racial, des couleurs, de personnes. Ma question est celle-ci. Comment high school peut nous enseigner à propos du système racial qui est en dehors de l'école là, mais quand eux-mêmes, ce système règne à l'intérieur? Je ne sais pas comment. C'est un peu paradoxal pour moi.
Je peux essayer de te répondre. Je ne vais pas te répondre en français, mais en anglais.
Would you mind repeating the question for people who didn't?
And maybe the way that I interpreted your question is how can art education challenge or be engaged with critically these systems of oppression and these racial systems at play, which exists technically beyond the institution, but inherently are also within us and also being at play within our institutions and within our faculties. Is that close? C'est proche? Okay, merci. I think that is a huge question and one that every institution is contending with right now. And as Cara mentioned, the words are often present before the systems and the actionable, let's say, processes and methods for addressing those systems of oppression, which all higher level education institutions were not built for racialized bodies, and that's just the truth. They were meant to maintain white supremacy and white and colonial narratives. So that is just the truth. That's our baseline. And then from there, we have to recognize that our society is the same thing. Art in my opinion, plays a really unique role in being able to address those systems critically if we choose to do it actually, if we choose to engage them honestly and in a real way. The other truth is that not all educators are prepared to do that work. And that's something that I think universities are contending with right now and that students are addressing right now. And I think student voices actually lead the charge in this regard often. Students want an anti-racist pedagogy. They want to be learning from diverse voices, from diverse experiences, from diverse backgrounds. And when we talk about art history, we're not talking about a colonial art history. We're talking about art history of the world. We're talking about making across this globe. And so I don't know if we are necessarily in a place where that paradox that you speak of can be addressed or properly kind of, let's say, teased out. We're not there yet, but I think that students need to continue to fight for that, and many of your educators will continue to fight for that. I know I do all the time. I know many of these panelists, if not all, do all the time. And so it's continuing to do the work to undo that harm and to undo those systems of oppression. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is the long game, and it should be the objective, I think, of art schools and of universities, higher education spaces. One thing that I will say is that one way that we can do that pretty directly is by hiring diverse faculty, particularly, I mean, POC, differently abled, different identities. I think it's incredibly important. But then additionally creating those systems of support for those colleagues, for those faculty members, not asking them to be in a system that is not meant to support them, but rather bringing them in and creating an institution which is flexible, adaptable, reciprocal, so that it can actually maintain support and care for the people that are present. So long-winded way to say we're not there. I don't think that we can deal with that paradox right now, or entirely right now, but that the work is being done by so many brave and spectacular students and brave and spectacular faculty.
Does anyone else on the panel want to speak to that question before anyone else? Yes. Question?
Yeah, I studied in England and I also studied at OCA DU.
Could you put the mic just a little bit closer?
In Toronto at OCA. In England, the art schools were the huge conglomerate of art schools in England were started basically mostly after the Second World War because they wanted, the initiative was to get people who were essentially, mostly boys who were causing problems because they were fatherless because of the Second World War, into a place where they could develop in all sorts of different ways. So it was this very lateral thought process in terms of education. And, you know, as a result, many of the, sort of foremost famous bands came out of art schools. And so the thinking was very wide, very, like all sorts of different activities could be had in that system. I also went to Ontario College of Art, and it initially was modeled on the Bauhaus. So the idea was that as a student there, you could transfer into any kind of department. I mean, I was an illustration student, but I also did industrial design, and I went into the shop, and I did all sorts of things. So so my question is, does the art school that I'm listening to about here have a model?
That's an interesting question.
We hope to build a new model.
Is there anyone here who feels they can take that question on?
I think it's important to know the models, and actually Olivier Asselineau talks about the Bauhaus model in his essay. But I think it is very important to, as art school, to question that model and then constantly rebuild, undo, rebuild, and I'm doing my bit in the department to do that. Not always easy to rebuild and undo. Very strong system, but I think that's what we try to do, and we keep trying to do. And I think this might cover Moise's question as well.
I think we'll take one more question, and because we have two more topics to get to. Michael Schreier, do you have a question?
Thank you, Penny. First of all, thank you for this. It's remarkable what we're sitting in on. Initially, all I want to do is say thank you to all the individuals I worked with over the years at Ottawa U, the Visual Arts Department. To speak to the question of model, all our debates in faculty meetings always address the issue of model in some way. And at every moment when something became convincing, it was then challenged. And that is incredibly important. I would like to offer just two anecdotes in the context of where we are. The first anecdote is from a student who I had in first year in photography many years ago. And he was doing a body of work that dealt with war and authority and fascism at a very, very young period in Canadian history when it was even being considered. And when he was finished the body of work, I said to him very naively, "So what's your experience in war? What do you know about it?" He said, "I was in the shadow cabinet of Franco in Spain." At that point, I had very little to say. I had to listen. I had to deal with the witnessing of what a student brings into the department as an experience that's important. The second anecdote, fast forward many years, fourth year student in second semester is blocked. And I never gave assignments. I let the student do their work, and when they brought the work in, then we would have our conversations. This person had real difficulties trying to get past a certain point in her work. So I suggested to her, why not go home and photograph your favorite room in your house? A room of one's own, Virginia Woolf, Gaston Bachelard, Poetics of Space. So she went home, and no, actually, when I made the suggestion, she laughed. And I said, "What's so funny?" And then there was a pause, and she started to cry. And I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "I've been cleaning my house, my room of my house, all my life." What that brought up was something incredibly important in the process of teaching, and that is the ethics of sensitivity and witnessing. That when you teach in a department, and I've had the privilege of being associated with Ottawa U for many years, it is one of the most important experiences I've had in my life, because what it has challenged in me as an artist is to question the whole nature of contemporary ethics and how we contribute to the broader sense of the world. And at the time that we're living in now, it's incredibly important if any university community challenges the viability and makes a visual arts department vulnerable or a creative department vulnerable. As has been spoken to recently, that particular university is obsolete. That it is now the time where the departments come together and speak to the notions of truth, witnessing, and to a reconviction for the fact that there is such a thing as truth, irrespective of what may have been challenged by French philosophers in the 70s, that we now live in some simulacra, there is no longer truth. Well, if that's true, how can we believe them?
Thank think we will move on to our next question, which in a way, the next question is what are the expectations of students coming into a visual arts department, and how might those expectations be met? I think Sarah touched on some of those questions a bit, but I'm going to turn it to Anna, who just before the panel began was relating an interesting anecdote to me about her expectations of receiving an art historical education and how that played out in the world.
So I went in with these ideas that I wanted to be a curator. I called myself a rock star curator because I had these lofty ambitions of traveling the world and curating. But then in my master's, I decided to focus on research that was about Indigenous art. It was about street art and graffiti art and community building. And not being Indigenous, I needed to educate myself more on community and on cultural practices, so I did my co-op at Minwashin Lodge, and I learned about a culture program there, and from there I found myself being more involved with supporting the families there, and after a while I found myself at our off-site violence against women's and family shelter, Oshki Kizis. I've been there now for 10 years, and it was this interesting world where I was working in social work. I was working in homeless outreach, but actively writing in these academic spaces. It was like these two worlds, but they were not sort of divorced of each other. They did combine together. The pedagogy and the things that I learned at Oshki, at Minwashin, I brought with me to my teaching. Like we were talking about listening to students. Some of the assignments that my students had involved writing about themselves, writing about how, if there was work made about them or their community or their identity, what would that work look like? I encouraged them actually, instead of writing even a paper, to make that work and express themselves. And these are in my non-Western futurism and folk art classes. And I was just amazed with all the things that the students were teaching me. And so I found a way to create this, you think that it's, social work and homeless outreach and art history, but there's a way that there are always these bridges that can be made through your experiences. And that's something that I also learned with art history, even before I went into that we were learning, when we had to look at an artwork, we had to learn about the historical context. We were learning about cultural contexts and social contexts, and we weren't just learning about this was taken with a camera, this is with acrylic paint. We were learning what the artwork meant, and I felt like that opens up to so many fields that you can go to after art school, even not to say don't do art after, but even if you graduate and you're like, maybe there's something else that I want to do, but art school helps guide us, in my opinion, to those spaces. And now I can't see a world where I'm not both doing outreach and teaching, because I find that they both work well together.
And none of this you could have anticipated when you signed up to study art history?
No, not at all. Yeah.
Cara, would you like to speak to this?
Sure, so expectations.
Expectations and how they might be met.
Yeah.
Are met or not met.
Yeah. Well, I think it's sort of very different if you're talking about master's students and undergraduate students. Master's students are often, encouraged to target a school because it can give them a particular thing, right? Or it can support them in a very particular kind of way. I did my MFA at the University of Ottawa, and I went in very much wanting to acquire particular skills and engage with a very specific body of literature. And the 2 years that I had in the institution absolutely gave me access to those skills. And I graduated and I felt, more equipped actually to build the kind of creative career that I've gone on to have since then. BFA students, the expectations are again, there's no one monolithic set of expectations. And what I've found really interesting, I've just spent the past year teaching first-year students in a studio course, and that was a relatively new experience for me. I'd mostly taught upper-level courses before that. And I found the first year very challenging because a lot of it was really just teaching them how to be students more than it was about imparting a particular, technical skill set. That was certainly part of it, but a lot of it was just about, teaching them how to navigate the institution, right? And then the other thing I'll say is that they also all come in with, a certain kind of conditioning. So while I always try and, create like a space of radical pedagogy where I am like drawing from Paulo Freire and bell hooks and trying to create spaces where I'm as much a learner as they are, and we're sort of collaborating in the content and in the way that it unfolds throughout the course time. They often come in, with a lifetime of being socialized in a very sort of hierarchical, authoritarian education model. So for me, a lot of that first year is about, inviting them to feel like they can take a bit more agency, they can, take control of their education and not feel so controlled by it. So about trying to maybe challenge some of the ways that downward hierarchical learning is being handed to them. But again, we are working within a hierarchical learning environment, so there's only so much wiggle room within that. But so are the expectations being met? I do think they are. And I also think there's this moment of recalibration for a lot of students early in their academic career where they're like, oh, this is what I'm here for. This is what a university actually is. It's not, yes, it is, for many of them, it is just sort of like a logical next step. And once they actually figure out what it is and how to maneuver it, it can be very exciting to send them through. And ultimately, I think that what our job is to put, as many tools at their disposal. And I think the biggest thing that we can do for them is actually really just encourage and celebrate, because that sort of one-on-one recognition, I think, you called it witnessing, and I think it is witnessing when you do that like one-on-one engagement with a student and you can find a little piece of something that you both relate about and connect with them, even if it's for, 10 minutes every 2 weeks, because we do have, bigger and bigger class sizes, and I try always and have one-on-one meetings and have that moment of connection, and find the thing that sort of makes them sparkle and just say like, yeah, that's great. I'm really excited by that too. That can go a really, really long way.
Yes, thank you. Jinny?
I would like to share maybe some observations that I've had over the last 21 years or so that I've been teaching at universities. I like teaching first-year painting courses because I like to see who's coming in, and I think it's important for full-time faculty members to teach first-year courses. And so one of the questions that I ask when in my first class is, what are your expectations? And I've noticed in the last 20 years or so that the expectations have changed somewhat. There is a lot more desire for practical skills. Students are a lot more realistic, a lot more conservative, and I do not blame them. I feel very bad for the young students these days because they are living in a world with this, impending doom. Which when I went to school, I went to art school in the 90s, we did not have this idea of the future will be worse than it is now. We just did not have this thought at all. So there was a lot more freedom in a way where we just went because we liked making art, and we don't know what we'll do after we graduate, but that's all right because we didn't have this fear of the future not being better than what we're living now. But these younger students, they do. And so I did notice that the expectations are much more practical. A lot more students are going into education, like in high school education and so on. They want something that is very actual and realistic. Is that being met? I don't think so. I think it is important for artists to have skills, and I do teach skills as well. But I think it is also very important for us to not be wrapped up in some kind of ideological tendency without critical thinking. And so I think it is very important for us to teach that aspect as well, and not just give everything that is expected, just as practical skills and practical applications post BFA particularly. As Cara said, BFA and MFA are very different, and I do think that MFAs have very even more clear expectations when they come in. They want to make it as an artist. A lot of them want to be professors, and a lot of them are successful in meeting their expectations. But I do hope that MFA gives more than just grounding for those practical life skills, which I think is very important because one must know how to survive to keep making art. This is a very important skill that I think art schools may not give in a way that is really direct, because there are no direct way of somehow making it out there. But just like a convoluted way of saying, I've noticed some differences in expectations, and I feel very bad for them, but they are very bright and smart, so hopefully we will have a new generation of artists who are able to somehow shape the world in a way that is good for us all.
Thank you. Sarah?
So, I mean, agreed. Right off the bat, it's totally different going into your BFA versus your MFA. Your bachelor's, I mentioned before that you may be going because, mom and dad are like, you gotta go do something, gotta get out of the basement. But at that level, it tends to be, you're there for the technical skills. Best case scenario, you leave with a more critical mindset. You've built some community, but I want to focus more on the MFA experience, and being a recent graduate from the Ottawa MFA program, and someone who I enjoy that experience very much. Maybe what I'll do is, for anyone who's considering perhaps doing a master's program, I'll just shoot straight on this. Aside from the clear things that are appealing about those programs, right? Like there's intensive training, you have access to facilities, you have dedicated time to work on your practice, you have an extended time with a dedicated studio space, you have networking opportunities. The list goes on and on and on and on. Those are some of the things that you sort of anticipate being more available to you. But in my experience, the most important expectation is the one that you have of yourself, right? We can hope and strive for the institution to meet those expectations, and they have a responsibility to do that. But in my experience, it was really helpful, actually, and I found that it was the most beneficial attitude to say, all right, how am I going to harness this incredible privilege, because it is a privilege. And if you are someone who is able to go and sort of be in one of those institutions and to go through that time, and you are able to, perhaps you have good funding from the program, or maybe you just, you can afford to take 2 or 3 years off to focus just on making work. I mean, that alone is an incredible privilege. So in my opinion, I think doing your utmost to be available and to be open and to work as hard as you possibly can, sort of externally and internally. I can go on and on this point, but I think it's about rigor and it's about gratitude ultimately. So and for me, there's a bit of a sense of safety, I will say, in that attitude, because if that expectation isn't being met, then you know, there's almost like a sense of reclaiming of power in a sense. I mean, of course, there are external factors that are at play here, but for me personally, I found it beneficial to say, all right, I'm also accountable here, and I'm not going to expect to be handed anything. I think that's sort of what I had to say on that. Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing that we're tight, so I'll try to be very concise. I want to acknowledge a few things. First, that art school in and of itself is a huge privilege. To go into a faculty where we don't get to go to the art factory is really scary and daunting for a lot of people, and a lot of people don't have the privilege of that time or that experience or that, let's say, risk even, right, or maybe even further indulgence of exploring creativity or art and design as a means of living or of education and subsequently of living. So expectation-wise, I'm so glad that you bring up first years, Cara, because I also have been teaching. I mean, I have the privilege of kind of bouncing back and forth between grad studies and first year predominantly is how I teach at Emily Carr. And it's fun to be with grad students because their expectation is that they're going to come in and be in conversation. So many grad students come in as professional artists already with practices, with approaches, with critical thought, and kind of, I don't know, they're already engaged in this work. And so their expectation is to be further engaged in that work and that critical thinking, but also to do it in community and to do it in relation to artists, to build community. I think that often those expectations are met. At Emily Carr, those expectations were very much met for me in terms of community. As a Black student who's never actually had a Black professor, ever, that expectation was not met, that I would learn from maybe somebody who looks like me, somebody who could engage critically with my lived experience, which then is interpreted through my visual practice. So that's something that wasn't met, and I think that isn't met for many students of color. So that's something that I want to put out there. And then at the undergrad level, I agree that they're coming in kind of expecting that we're going to tell them what to do. I also take the first, let's say, 30 minutes of my class, every single class that I teach, to share our names, our pronouns, how we're doing that day, and to do a territorial acknowledgement. And in almost every single one of my course reviews, I get, Becky made us speak too much about our feelings. so I think in many ways, maybe those approaches shift student expectations, because I don't think that the expectation should be that we're just learning how to make art. We're learning how to be together. We're learning how to be in reciprocal conversation. And that's a really essential part of art school. And I recognize that what I'm gonna say next is a bit of a daring opinion, but I'll say it anyways. I don't think that students should go to art school if they just wanna learn how to make art. Because at this point in our ever accessible world, you can learn that online. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars to learn how to make art. You can do that. What we're doing here is being critical together, is learning from one another. And that's something that I'm sure most master's students miss desperately when they leave school, is that you're not in that same kind of community, conversational, critical space where you get to learn from your peers. You get to engage with practices that are far beyond your own. And so kind of back and forth between the two, between BFA and MFA, I think that we often meet and exceed student expectations, but I also recognize that there's a lot of work to be done and a lot that can still be done. And I think it's very much about learning how to be, again, critical, creative, global citizens, recognizing that we aren't making in silos. We're not just art. We're so much more. We come with our subjectivities, we come with our experiences, we come with our kind of nuances, and we get to butt up against each other's nuances, subjectivities, and that's a huge privilege where in most other spaces you don't get to do that. And so I think in many ways expectations are being met, and I hope students are being challenged actually in terms of their expectations. And also it shifts, I think, year to year. The last thing that I'll say is that in my classes right now, in terms of AI, this has shifted expectations drastically. And I recognize AI as a tool. I don't think that it should be banned from schools. I don't think that we should be afraid of it in academic settings. I think that we should learn how to deal with it and integrate it ethically and critically. And so many of my students, you know, we have this kind of agreement. We make community agreements as well, which again is about our feelings, and they stress about it because they're like, Becky, oh my gosh, I just want to learn. I'm like, well, that is learning. That's what we're doing here. But a lot of students, we get to have conversations about readings in class, and we get to talk about really beautiful academic texts. I love to bring in Braiding Sweetgrass, and I love to bring in all these texts that kind of shift the colonial narrative into a more expansive space, in a more representative space. And a lot of students are saying, well, why are we writing essays? I could just do this using AI. And I'm like, you could. You totally could. But then I don't know why you're spending thousands of dollars to do that. Why don't we instead take the time to figure out and to nurture these skills actually that we're working on together, which is about critical thinking, about creating connections, about seeing ourselves as part of the world, as a critical kind of engagement, or being critically engaged, let's say, with the world, rather than using these tools to get around building skills. And so I welcome AI in classrooms. I welcome these tools for support. I think that it's an accessibility tool at the kind of baseline. It is about access, and that's really special. I think that it's really important to use that. But if we don't write essays, then we don't know how to build connections. If we don't, I don't know, harness all these other skills, we're not doing the learning, and then we don't get to have the conversations together. And the conversations that we have together then kind of go nowhere. We can learn how to write about them. We can learn how to document them. We can learn how to put them in relation to one another. And that's really, really important work. So again, I hope that we're meeting student needs, but also stretching those kind of expectations. And yeah.
Thank you. Martin?
It's really beautifully said. I'll keep it brief because these ideas are, there's so many really good ideas about this very thing, and we've touched on so many of them that...
You put your mic...
we've touched on so many of them. One aspect that I want to bring up is this idea of this hunger for an environment for criticality and for sharing. I can't stress enough, and we've talked about it, but I will also add my voice to this, that especially for my MFA students coming into a program, they're really seeking to satisfy a hunger and a need that isn't met in the broader worlds that they live in. I can speak for myself that I was very outside of the realm of speaking about ideas and sharing and building community, and I wanted to come back to grad school after a decade or so, precisely in order to find that community. And so I'm very aware of that and sensitive to that. And as well, it's a chance to push oneself and to ask the questions that one has been meaning to ask, and to really put oneself through that rigor and that process of self-examination and testing. And I think that's really important. So I feel that those expectations, that students come with those expectations, and I think that the job is to meet them, is to meet that urgency and to meet that degree of passion and investment with criticality and with questioning and with an equal energy in a way. And that's the challenge of, I think that's the challenge of teaching. And what a wonderful challenge that is. And again, with BFAs, yes, the needs are different, but I do find that many BFAs and my classes are becoming more and more diverse with each passing year, which opens the opportunity for expanding that discussion, that colonially based curriculum that we've been handed down, that I've been handed down, to really open that up and in a way to break that down and to look at other avenues and other histories and other ways of making students feel seen. Because if there's one thing that I think that especially marginalized in the POC, students of mine want is to be able to feel that they can be part of that discourse, can be part of that discussion, that they too can also be an artist in the world. And so the discussions are an opportunity for the other students who may not understand Eastern ideas or other ideas that come from the South or the North, outside of the first world. It's a chance to bring those ideas in, and by doing so, build that very community, build that inclusivity, because the conversation expands. And I think that's something that's actually very exciting, and one that I think, being a member of an institution, it's my role to open that platform up completely and to bring in those diverse voices into that conversation.
Thank you. So everyone has spoken on that question. We'll open up to question and answer. And then because we're getting towards the end of our time, I think I will then ask each panelist to answer the third question in 2 sentences. So you're really going to have to think about whether there is a house aesthetic, such thing as a house aesthetic. But any questions around this topic of expectations that students have coming into either undergraduate and or graduate level art school, and how those expectations may or may not be met? Sir.
Thank you. My name is Jürgen Hod. I'm a second year student, bachelor level. This is my second career. I'm a biologist by training.
Are you a student in the Department of Visual Arts right now?
I am.
Okay.
I am. And this is my 7th university. I've been working on conservation of nature worldwide, but this is my 7th university, so I'm talking a little bit about universities. First of all, amazing that we have this fora, how it's about the school, the 50 years, it's an amazing celebration. But I see some contradictions here. It's confidential. Confidential is information that is to be kept secret. Should be the opposite. It's a celebration that we have 50 years, that of so much work going on, so many generations going through it. And so, second contradiction I would see is, this is about art school, so it's about students. Yet, there is no student in the podium, bachelor level, hardly any students here in the audience, hardly any student work in the exhibit.
You don't know that. You don't know that there's not student work.
Hardly any student work in the bachelor, no student work from the bachelor level. And there's stunning work, or hardly any. It's mostly professors level. The point here is that there is stunning work that is carried out every year from level 1, bachelor level, stunning, that needs to be also celebrated. Not only the accomplished artists that many of you are, but more, let's boost that self-esteem, that appreciation of students coming up, because there is really an amazing value that I didn't see here. So about critical thinking has been brought up a number of times by a number of you as in the podium. And I would say it has to go hand in hand with social responsibility. It's not about questioning everything, but in which direction. So yes, it's race, very important, and I like that question that we had up there, and your answer. It's about religion and the issues that are going on worldwide. It's about politics, and yet, so we want to have that type of students, and yet, see the outputs, and I invite you to see the outputs from the catalogs of the last 20 years, from bachelor and MFAs. It's almost all sheer navel gazing. What do I mean about it? There's hardly any questioning of the system. So this brings my third point. We as a university, are we really building, one thing you mentioned, Cara, words are ahead of our actions. So it's inspiration. So are we really, as a university, accomplishing having critical students that are ready to face the world, a world that is so much challenging on a daily basis with climate change and so on? It's been always been challenging. 20 years ago, it was Cold War. Now the world is about to finish any time. So now it's climate change. It's indeed a challenge. But we do need students that are ready to face this aspect. And so the last part is about art ecology. Coming from a biological background, I would say that all what I said is symptomatic of what I would call the doom in ecology is when you have small populations that are inbreeding, endogamy, that's what the name it is called. So I would say that the solution at the school is remove the director and have the director coming from other schools, so that there's an enrichment of ideas, but also teachers, have a shuffling of teachers with other schools, so that new ideas are instilled in students, and that's where I think we can then celebrate big new art and the high impact that the university can have. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone like to respond, or? Yes,
Yeah.
Anna.
I'll respond to the confidential part and then actually the end part, if that's okay. Thank you for your questions. So it's interesting that you mentioned the confidential, and as my student, one of the assignments was I was asking students to publicly publish their final projects, because I wanted to encourage students to realize that their knowledge is valid, that they do have the knowledge, that though we are learning something together as a class, that their opinions and their ideas on what we're learning in class are valid. They're not just for my eyes. They should share it. But also in that way, that adds that extra pressure of making sure that your sources are correct, making sure that you're not just sort of saying something to say something just because you need to get the paper or the assignment done. So also sort of when you're mentioning AI, that reminded me that some of the projects were Instagram accounts. Their finals were like a text and then an image on Instagram, where I always tell them you can make a TikTok or a YouTube. I've had YouTube like podcast style final projects, and all in art history. And so that's where maybe, I don't know if that's the road to go to, challenge the confidential aspect of how maybe we're, not to say hoarding all this knowledge, but I think with how technology shifts and how with also accessibility, I also see places like social media as these accessible spaces for students to share and gain knowledge. So why don't we just work with that? So I think we're still figuring out maybe what are these new steps or these next steps to go with being more accessible and being less confidential. But also a point about bringing in people from different departments. I've noticed it here and there it happens. I know there's sometimes cross-appointed. I know when I was an undergrad, there was one art history course that I took, but it was in the religious studies department. And I know that one of my colleagues, Selena Jeffrey, she worked with, I believe it was the geography department, and there was this work on looking at Arctic, looking at artists from the Arctic, but also looking at the science of that region. So there are these specks of these moments where there's this sort of these cross-appointed moments, and perhaps maybe what we need to do more as institutions is to publicize those a lot more, and even with each other, work more together and not just stay in our little bubbles. But yeah, so there's pockets of it, but perhaps we need more.
I'd like to add one thing about I'm going to call it cross-pollination, because I can. But I like to think, for example, when I was a student here, I was a BFA student at the University of Ottawa. And when I was a student here, my electives were some of my absolutely favorite classes and fundamentally changed how I thought about art. For example, my absolute favorite class actually I've ever taken, and I would retake it if I could. I can't remember the name of the prof, but it was called Women in Religion. And it was spectacular. And I'm not a religious person, and I'm not practicing by any means, but that space of engaging with feminist theory, with religion, with all these things in one space was so exciting to me. And I agree with you about the importance of working together, and this is part of what I was bringing up at the beginning. You know, at Emily Carr, we're an art and design university. We have, I think, 3,500 students. That's it. There's UBC around the corner, there's SFU around the corner, there's Kwantlen, there is the University of Canada West, there's VCC. There's so many schools all around us, but we are a singular institution that works in art and design. Here, we have the privilege, I think, of that cross-pollination a lot more, with electives, with that space for kind of expansive learning. I think the other thing to consider is that we're all, again, we spoke about student subjectivities coming into the classroom. Professor subjectivities also come into the classroom, and that back and forth, I think, is really important, that the professors that we have aren't, again, coming from, I'm gonna keep saying it, because I love the student, Nikki is the student's name. We're not all coming from the art factory where we only make art all the time. We have big, expansive lives, like as you do, right? A whole past that informs how we make now. And I think that those things inherently and inevitably come into the classroom as well. And that's also the space for kind of that cross-pollination. That said, I think that that should also happen between institutions. I think it should happen across the country in particular, but obviously all over the world. But I think we have a really cool opportunity to do that across the country. Maybe I'll stop there because I know we're very short.
One more, someone who hasn't asked a question? Yes. Could we give this?
Yeah,
Oh,
he has one.
Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry, he has a mic.
Hi, my name is Yomi. Thank you for having the panel. So my question is to the educators. I think over the past few years, we've seen an increase in globalization, whether that's through immigration increasing over the last years or just the internet being more exposed to different cultures. And at the same time, there's been an increase in technological advancement. You mentioned AI, Becky, you mentioned social media. My question to the educators is, how often do you find yourself playing the role of the student again because of all this change? And what challenges do those bring up? And how do you decide what to then take into the classroom and what not to? Because, you know, the students are expecting you for, looking up to you for education, but you're also finding yourself in the position of the student. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I'm constantly learning. Like the minute I wake up and open my Instagram, you know, I'm strategically following cultural producers and creators and writers. And so every day I'm reading and I'm writing. And that informs what I bring in the classroom on a weekly basis. You know, I often tell my students, you know, this semester I taught 3 classes, so 2 4-hour classes and 1 3-hour class. And I tell, you know, I'm like, okay, you know, when you do your 15-minute presentation, how much do you work on that to get those 15 minutes tight and concise? Because I'm doing that all week long just to be in a classroom for 3 hours. But it is about, you know, being nimble and using the tools that we have access to. For me, Instagram is one of my biggest teachers right now because I'm following people who have the expertise that I don't, as well as, you know, still staying in tune with some of the academic publications, the traditional modes of knowledge dissemination. And yeah, just bringing work into the classroom that is exciting me and constantly sort of upending what I think I know about the world because it is forever changing right before our eyes.
I also very much learn from Professor Instagram as well. And I'll often just be scrolling, I'll be like, oh, save, oh, my students will love, like, I'm constantly looking. And because it's so wide reaching, there is this more sort of diverse range of artists. And sometimes I'll show someone to my students, and the next thing I'm reading papers about a friend of mine that I made online who's an artist, and I'm saying, oh, here's the 4th paper about your work, and they just feel like, oh, I never knew that people would write about my work. And I also try to even include friends of mine who were in the BFA, or even if they went into the MFA, to show students that you are producing work that will one day be taught in a classroom. Your work is valid enough to be in this classroom. To be like taught after. Like it's not just something you're making for 4 years or 6 years if you're doing an MFA. Well, not altogether, but yeah. And so I definitely learn a lot from my students as well. I've only been teaching some of my courses sort of 2 years in a row now. I'm quite fresh as an educator. But anything I learn from my students in one class, I make a mental note to try to bring that to the next class. Because I'm like, oh, this is what they said was missing, or this is what they would have liked to see more. Okay, that's in this class now. And I was still a student until January, so I feel like maybe I still have that fresh ideas of this is what I would have wanted to see as if I was a student. So it's a great sort of marriage of learning from my students and then doing the sort of sharing circle almost of like, well, what are we gonna learn next year? How are we gonna develop this course? So I have my students to thank for every year that I update my syllabus. It's because of them.
I'll say very, very quickly, I promise, Penny, and to the crowd. A few things that teaching is fundamentally about learning. And again, if we think about Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress or Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, we know that teaching is about learning. We know that teaching is about creating reciprocal spaces for education, not just the hierarchical top-down approach. And so I think that the most exciting, the most engaged teachers, professors, educators are ones who are actively learning all the time and whose classrooms are participatory and not transactional, but reciprocal. And so I don't think that the new perspectives that I'm not informed of are a challenge. I think that they're actually an incredible opportunity. I feel so lucky to be able to learn from my students all the time. And I'm constantly learning. Also a huge student of, I'm gonna say, the internet and kind of this globalized access is incredible. Those sensitivities are brought into the class. I recognize that our students are learning from those platforms as well, so not treating them as if they aren't valid, that they aren't useful, making sure that we're engaged, in the learning processes that our students are going through so that we're not detached from this activity of learning to be able to teach, to be able to share, to be able to participate.
Thank you. I think we will move on to that exciting question. Is there a house aesthetic? Is there a brand associated with different art schools? And maybe we'll start with Jinny. 2 sentences. Plus ou moins.
I hope there isn't in any schools. And I hope we don't either. That's something that I absolutely wanted when I came here, to not have one style.
Sarah?
Yeah, the exact same answer. I hope not. I think the aim should be the exact opposite. That's, I won't go on. Yes.
I'll say something, if I may. In my very hasty research, learning how to give a good panel, one comment was, if you're the moderator, don't say anything, because then who's going to moderate you? So you're welcome to moderate me, but I have taught in 3 different universities and art schools, and I have to say that every once in a while I have seen a teacher whose students produced very predictable work that might have looked like the students' work, and I swear, I really mean this, I have not seen this at Ottawa U. I'm not talking about what I have encountered at Ottawa U, but seen when work looked like the teacher's work, or if the teacher said, now when you're making photographs, they must be large, then everyone made large works in order to pass the course. And what was really remarkable was that very few of those students continued on, because they were not encouraged to find their own quote-unquote voice. They were encouraged to produce a very acceptable product, And I would say that that's a failure of teaching. And I've seen it rarely, but when I've seen it, there was that searching for a brand to replicate a brand, and I don't consider that teaching.
I'm going to steal back one of my sentences. I think, just to your point, that one of the strengths of the U Ottawa program that I noticed, and I was speaking with a fellow member of my cohort yesterday about, just sort of preparing for these questions, and one of the things that came up in conversation was, one of the most valuable takeaways was the challenge that was put to us by the faculty not to sort of adhere to what we think art should be, or the rules around it, or any particular medium or topic. A good part of the value of it was being challenged to find our own identity and our own voice and our own opinions, right? When we're talking about criticality, that's what it comes down to, is to actually form an opinion rather than be, working in a silo or an echo chamber where you're just all sort of spouting off the same things to each other. Okay, that's as fast as I can make it. Okay.
I can't ask you to keep to 2 sentences because I realize I didn't. Cara.
I would say that there are at times pockets and trends, but that I haven't seen any kind of like prevailing large school emerge necessarily from the University of Ottawa, but pockets and trends are great, and to echo Becky bringing Paulo Freire into the room, we're also learning from our students, and when we're lucky, we're in collaboration with them and we're doing work with them. So yeah, it is a community of exchange ultimately.
Just very quickly, yes, absolutely. When I read that question, it was like, I really hope not. That's the last and worst goal of any institution. I think the goal really is to challenge aesthetic presumptions, but at the same time cultivate curiosity, and that involves being challenged oneself. So I'm challenged every day about what might be aesthetic, or what might be quality, or what might be good from my students. And through that process of learning, opening up possibilities for aesthetics that come from non-Western and non-traditional and non-canonical sources that might have been marginalized in the past, but now must be included front and center in what we consider to be aesthetic.
Yes, I was going to say there definitely is not, but I can also hope there is not. Coming from an art historical perspective, even other art historians, we all wrote about different things, and we all had different writing styles. And just from like even a curatorial perspective, like you could even see with the works exhibited, there is such a diversity of identity and of expression. And I think maybe that's the style that like everyone's doing work about their identities. But the beautiful thing about that is that every work is diverse and different, and that is a joy to see. And from, again, an art historical perspective, it helps students learn how to write about creating dialogues between different communities and different experiences, instead of just the same thing over and over again.
I also hope not. But maybe what I do hope is that schools are about diversity and interdisciplinarity, and that we're not replicating but extending. And I hope that those practices are inherent to art schools. I think that that's a pretty hopeful future if we can take that on.
Any questions on this? Ilya. Ilya. Do we have a mic?
Thank you so much. So I'm a product of the visual arts program at U Ottawa. I graduated in 2007. And I have to say, coming as a francophone, coming from Northern Ontario, this was the only choice to come to U Ottawa or to go to Moncton. And I remember in the interviews, we used to have one-on-one interviews to get into the program. And that was the first thing I had asked, what am I going to learn here, compared to the other school? And it was all the critical knowledge, the critical thought, right? The first book we read was Bell Hooks, right? In my first year. And the program became a term of reference for my master's degree in Switzerland, and then for my PhD back here in gender and sexuality studies, and then my postdoc in South Africa. And I always remember the critical discussions, the knowledges that we have, especially as Francophones, because we had, I think, perhaps different ways of thinking coming from, minority linguistic areas. So that's great, and I think that as universities now are going through a difficult time. I'm also a product of the tenured professors at Laurentian that got laid off because of the insolvency. So I know that universities are struggling right now financially and have to go in front of the provincial government and ask for money and blah, blah, blah. I think that the art school has a potentiality and has perhaps well equipped to face those sort of cuts. But also, I hope that the universities understand the importance of art school because it is interdisciplinary. You don't go in to become a painter. I mean, you touch everything, right? So I hope that works. The other point I want to mention is that my education in Switzerland, which was a huge challenge for me because it was a program that we applied the knowledge that we learned, right? We weren't talking about Paulo Ferrer, we were actually doing the work, right? We were doing the work with communities in Brazil. We were working with, refugees. And so I think that while universities and art schools in Canada are doing great work, I think that we also have to be more critical about the system and perhaps challenge the system, right? Whether it be the banking education, right? You need 120 credits to get your diploma. Well, we could go against that, right, in certain ways. Some universities are doing it, through a decolonial perspective, and I don't think there's a right way of doing it or a wrong way, but I think that, art school or an art department is, I guess, le noyau, si on veut, de l'institution académique qui va permettre justement de revoir à l'éducation qui est à venir dans les prochaines années. Voilà.
I think we'll have one more question, and this lady in the background didn't get last time the mic, so.
It's not so much a question, but a comment. One, I want to express my thanks to all of you for the candor of the discussion, for the social relevance of the questions coming from those of us sitting here on this side of the issue. And historian that I am, it just happens that in today's New York Times, there was a small article noting that on this day in April 28th, 1937, is when Guernica was bombed. And as you know, I'm sure, the story, Picasso was so strongly moved by that is where his mural came from. It was exhibited at the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, horrifying people. And it continues to this day to be the painting that speaks the truth, that shows the truth, that is the finger pointed at the truth. And that's what we also need of this time too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists. I wish we had a couple more days to delve into all of these questions. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Ottawa Art Gallery. Megan, for all of your organization to make this happen. And to everyone who turned out today, your questions were wonderful. And Ilya, when are you becoming president of Ottawa U? I know, a couple years. Thanks so much.